Hey, welcome to another episode of dotnetFlix. Our guest today is Maurice de Beijer.
Hi there.
You're going to talk about test-driven development with React, right?
Yep.
Awesome, let's dive in.
Okay, so let's do some test-driven development. And I've kind of got some simple specs here, like we're going to create a registration form for a user.
Okay.
And depending on the country, the Netherlands or the USA, or for that matter other countries, but I only support 2 in this little demo, we get a slightly different UI. So I've got a slight simple wireframe here for the Netherlands. We want the first name, last name and the country, but in the USA they typically want to know your state.
Yeah.
So it's first name and then the state should appear.
Okay.
So TDD, test-driven development, typically kind of means that you make your test first.
Yep.
Now people typically find that really hard to do with UI stuff. Like if you do a calculator or something functional like that, determine whether some number is a prime number or something, that's typically relatively easy to do.
Yeah.
And those tend to be the demos you see with TDD.
Yeah.
Because it's so simple.
Yeah.
And then people come, with components, well, that's hard. And what I see most developers do is they write a component and then afterwards they try to create a test for it.
Yeah.
And then, but it's hard to test, can't we skip the test? No, you can't, because we need to write solid production code.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it turns out that doing it in a test-driven way, in many cases, isn't actually that hard. Now I'm really going to do TDD here. We're going to start from scratch. Like I've got my application running and it's actually failing on an import because it's trying to import a registration form component which doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. Which is obvious because you haven't written any code yet.
Yeah, I've got tests here. No errors there, but that's because there is no test yet either.
Yeah.
So what am I going to use? Well, where's Visual Studio Code gone? Here. I need some kind of testing framework.
Yeah.
And normally with Create React App you get Jest, and that works actually really well. So that's our test runner. And then we need some kind of library to test React components. And typically you see people use either Enzyme there or testing library.
Okay.
And I used to use Enzyme a lot, and with Enzyme I actually found TDD quite hard, because with Enzyme you typically test component internals. So you typically use CSS selectors to find something, which means like I have to think about IDs or classes, stuff like that I put in there.
Which is really hard if you haven't had any stuff up yet.
Quite often you'll check whether the internal state of a component is whatever you expect it to be, etc. So Enzyme, pretty good, but it doesn't really work for me in this case. It doesn't feel natural. Testing library, on the other hand, does. So what I'm using is this one, Add Testing Library React. And that basically renders your component and lets you interact with it. But the suggestion is, what they strongly encourage, interact with your component in the same way the user would.
Yeah. Okay.
So if I open up the wireframe, suppose I want to enter a first name. Well, I need to look for this input.
Yep.
Search for the input based on the associated label. So search for first name and find the input.
Yeah.
I want to click on the register button. Well, search for the text register, not search for a button with a specific ID or something.
Yeah,
search for the text register and click on that.
That's nice, so you're not breaking any solid principles by exposing internals.
Which also means that I can make my components in the most simple way possible.
Yeah.
And then worry about making it pretty and adding classes to it afterwards.
And it's independent of the implementation. So whether it's a link or a button or whatever, it will work, but it's clicking the register function.
Search for the register text and click on that, whatever it may be.
Whatever it is, nice.
And in my requirements, it's like one of the requirements, but it's actually intentionally the last one, is style it using Bootstrap. Because for the functionality, that doesn't matter. That's kind of like a refactor action. Okay, I've got a working form, now make it pretty.
Nice.
Doesn't change the behavior, or at least it shouldn't. So, let's actually get started. And being TDD, I'm going to start with a test. So I'm going to create a registration form test, which is going to render the registration component which doesn't actually exist, so that test should fail.
Yeah.
So I'm doing some imports from React testing library and of course React. And I'm also adding a utility, the just DOM extend expect from the testing library, which will give you additional ways of checking components.
Okay.
Like they're less technical than the standard jest ones,
Okay.
which makes sense. So calling the render function, which returns a couple of functions. So the render function will render a component, registration form, but that doesn't exist yet. So if I go to my test,
Yeah, it fails.
it fails.
As expected.
Yeah, it should. It's test driven.
Yep.
So the normal step is do the simplest thing you can. So let's create a component. Let's make it really simple. Registration form. It's really not going to do anything useful. Just return null. But at least it is a valid component. So back to the test running, and that should be green now.
You're done. You can go home.
Ship it.
Yeah, ship it. Like, tell the users we're happy. Like, my first test is just, can I actually render this component? And it's not a very useful component, but it does.
Yep.
And if I go back to the application, no errors anymore, because it renders an empty component.
Yeah.
But this is kind of a technical test that it renders a valid
Yeah,
component.
but it's a first step.
Yeah.
It's a baby step. And to be honest, I typically don't really do these baby steps when I'm actually developing. I'm kind of exaggerating the point a bit now.
Yeah.
It's like I would typically do a bit more in the first step, but baby steps for the demo.
Okay.
So next thing is, okay, we want to expand our test because we know there should be specific buttons and headers there. So there should be a registration header there. There should be a register button there. There should be a first name and a last name input, and there should be a country input.
And this expect function is from the jest.
Yeah,
library.
the expect function is from jest. So that basically says, okay, in my test, expect something to be something. In this case, I expect that the text registration is in the component and is actually visible.
Yeah.
So the helpers here I'm using from React testing library, get by text just searches for some text on the screen.
Yep.
And in this case I'm passing in a string, which means look for a component which has exactly that text. You can also pass in a regular expression, so if you want to do a case insensitive or a sub match or something like that. Or if you want to be real flexible, you can pass in a function which is basically called with each DOM element which is rendered, and you can decide whether it's a match or not.
So you could even check whether or not some values appear in a table or a list or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then the to be visible checks, okay, that should return a valid DOM element, and then that DOM element should actually be visible, so it checks for things like display hidden or display none, or even the parents of it to be display none. As far as I know, it doesn't check for color. So if you render it with a white text on a white background, it's not going to be visible for an end user, and I think it still passes this, but that's kind of like, well, we're probably not going to do that.
And you can also test for it not being visible, if that would be the case.
You could do something like .not visible.
Okay.
The only caveat there is get by text. Get by text will fail if the text doesn't exist.
Okay.
So there are a number of functions you can use, and they're basically grouped into 3 groups. There is get, query, and find.
Okay.
Get will search for that whatever you're searching for, in this case text, and fail if it's not there.
Yeah.
Query will search for that text, and if it's not there, return a null. But if it's there, it will return the DOM object or DOM object. Find will actually wait for it to appear if it isn't there, so it returns a promise, so you can do an await.
Nice.
And then all of those have a separation. There is the get by text and there is a get all by text. So the get by, and the same is true for the find and the query. The singular ones, they will search for a single element. If it finds 2, it will actually fail as well.
Okay.
Nice.
So get by text means that that text actually appears exactly once. query by text would be 0 or once, or query all by text would be 0 or more.
Okay.
And get all by text would be 1 or more.
Yeah.
So you can kind of vary that.
Nice.
Get label by text actually searches for a label associated with an input. So if I go back to my wireframe, so it searches for this input for the first name based on the label associated with it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So I actually get a reference back to the input elements, and I can start manipulating that, entering data in it,
Yep.
checking the value, etc.
Nice.
Of course, I've only expanded the test, so nothing to see there, but my test fails because I've not expanded the component.
Yeah.
Well,
Makes sense.
I guess you can figure out what the next step is, do minimal implementation. So add a header there, add a label with HTML4 to
Yep.
associate it with the actual input, and do the same for the button, etc. So we've got a basic, simple form layout. So there's our component, our test passes, and now we actually have some UI. Not pretty, but it's there. So we can
Yep.
enter a first name, we can
It's functional.
have a country there, we can put some data in there, we've got a register button. So the stuff we're looking for, the first name, last name, etc., the register button,
Yep.
all of that's there. So our test passes. So what other requirements did we have? Well, we want to be able to put some data in there.
Yep.
So, wrong hotkey. So let's create another test and render it with some data. So kind of write this very similar test to the first one, except now we're going to check whether there's specific data inside of those inputs.
Yep.
So render the form, but now we'll use me as a person, and I live in the Netherlands, so state doesn't actually matter. So we're still checking for those headers and the button text to be there, not actually using those, so I guess we could omit that from this test.
Yeah.
But now with the first name, instead of checking whether it's visible, we check to have values. So does the input, remember get label by text returns a reference to the input element. So we check whether that actually has the value Maurice and de Beijer, and the countries the Netherlands. And state should still be empty, but we can check for that.
Nice.
Now, in this case, because I'm using TypeScript, we already get a compile error here.
Yep.
Of course, we'll get an error in the test as well. It expects a value to be there, which isn't there.
Yep.
But the error is actually already obvious here, like it doesn't know about the person. TypeScript checks the actual props here, and this registration form has no person, so let's go and implement that. We'll add a person prop there. I was actually doing the lazy stuff without typing it, so TypeScript fans, please ignore that part. And I'm setting up the default prop so it can still be rendered without.
Yeah.
So now we see the values being set up.
Yeah. So you bind them to the model.
Yeah. The values from the different inputs. And our test should be green. Still have some errors, but the test should be green, and
it's good
still
enough.
looks the same way.
Yeah.
But the error messages, even though the test didn't fail on it, they're there for a reason. And if I go there and now start trying to type my first name in, nothing happens.
Okay.
That actually has to do with these error messages. So I'm binding the value, so I'm pretty much turning these components into what they call controlled components. So I control the value,
Okay.
which means that my application controls the value, but doesn't give the user any way to change that value without that unchanged. So they kind of say, well, that doesn't make sense unless you make them read-only, and they can't be changed anyway. So either add the unchanged or read-only. In this case, it should be a registration form, so read-only doesn't make sense. So I should add change handlers. So we'll create some state management in here. We'll take the person being passed in as the initial state, and we'll create a state handler to actually update that person every time something changed. So that function is going to get the name and the value currently there, and it basically just uses the spread operator to take the current person and then update one specific property.
Yep.
So add that to the different components, different inputs there, and state. Our test should still be green, but now the error messages should be gone.
Cool.
There it is. And now if I go back to the form, I can actually start typing in them.
Yep.
So, what else did we need to do? Well, if we look at the specs, where did I have them? So it says the first and the last name are required, and the register button should be disabled if the form is invalid.
Yeah.
And right now, if I refresh this, it's enabled.
So now that you've refreshed this, why isn't the oh no, that's only in your test case, right? So I was thinking about why is it filled in right now, but the date is only used in your test.
Yeah, the date is actually only used in the test, and in here I did set up a default person, but that's empty with the country NL.
Yeah,
so that's what you're seeing.
Yeah.
So
you need to add some validations.
Yeah, so let's add some more logic, and in fact in this case we can just start by changing the existing test, because in the first test we can now say, well, that register button should be there, but it should also be disabled. And the second test, where we have a person, it should be enabled.
Yeah.
So that's where I wanted to go. Of course my test fails because I didn't implement anything yet. So let's implement that, add a disabled prop to the register button, which checks whether both the first and the last name are disabled. Of course we can already see it in action here.
Yep.
But of course what we really wanted to see is the test passing, which passes.
Nice.
So we've got more requirements. Already displayed this in the mockups, but the state field should only be visible when the country is USA. And right now, it's always visible. State is here. If I change it to USA, it's still there. But if I change it to Netherlands, it shouldn't be visible. So let's add a test for that. So you see now that instead of using the get by text, I'm actually using the query by, or sorry, get by label text, I'm using query by label text, because get by always has to return something.
Yeah.
So I'm saying query by label, which could return something or could not, and I'm saying it should not be in the document.
Nice.
And in this case, the same for the Netherlands, should not be in the document. And of course, being test driven, my test is going to fail. And then we do the basic implementation. We put a little if statement around the state input for only the country of USA, and my test passes. Now, my test isn't very good yet, because I'm only testing whether it doesn't show up for the Netherlands. I'm not testing whether it actually does show up with the USA. So let's add another test and render a person in the USA. And of course that test should pass directly because we've kind of already implemented.
And
so I guess if,
again.
Of course, who else? If I did this purely test driven, I guess I should have written this test before I actually did the implementation.
Yeah. Yes.
This little bit I'm actually testing after the fact. But hey, it's
but it's
not a religion.
That can happen, that you're introducing a side effect which happens to be very useful.
Yeah, And it's not a religion. It's like, it's a tool to get something done, and it should not be like, you should always do TDD.
No.
It's like, I don't. I do this for regular components quite often, but not all the time. Especially not when I'm experimenting with how should I approach something. Then I'm not going to do it test driven.
Yeah.
It's a tool, use it when it makes sense. Use something else when that makes more sense. So my test run, they all passed, and we can just check whether the UI works. So USA, we see a state. Netherlands, we don't see a state.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
that looks pretty good. So back to the specs.
2 more to
The
go.
requirements.
Yeah.
Dus when the submit button is clicked, the onRegister callback should be called with the person enters. Well, I actually should stay in here. Let's write a test for that. So new test. It's going to use a jest mock function. So jest.fn gives a mock.
Okay. Yeah.
You can use that same expect as in the other test with the mock to check whether it's actually been called with specific values or so many times or things like that.
It's a quite elaborate testing framework now, so that's pretty
Yeah.
useful. Yeah.
So I'm also using fire event here, which is another testing library utility, and that will basically let me fake events on input. So I'm getting the input for the first name and last name. I'm firing an event to actually say that I'm entering Mike Jones in there.
Yeah.
Then I'm clicking the register button using that same fire event. In that case, I don't actually need event args. So, and then I'm saying, okay, expect that on register to have been called.
Cool.
Why do you need to specify a name in the target?
Because of the way my registration function was set up. Basically, I'm saying here, get the target, get the name and the value from there, and use the name as the property to set.
Okay, yeah.
And because it's not actually doing a change event on the component, it doesn't actually pick up that name from the component.
Yeah.
I'm kind of providing that target here. So I guess this test could pass even if in my real component last name was mistyped.
Yeah.
So it's not going to catch everything. Fails, to be expected.
Yep.
It actually says here number of calls is 0. So
We haven't hooked up any event handler to the button.
yeah, so let's do that. So the onClick will call onRegister. We'll first check whether there is actually a register, but then call onRegister with the current state of the person.
Yep.
And now my test passes.
Nice.
And for some reason it had something selected in there. I think we're pretty much there.
The last one, which is
The
interesting.
last one. Make it pretty. Well, Bootstrap,
Pretty-ish.
pretty-ish. I'm not a designer, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And my design skills are severely limited, so if I have to make something look reasonably good, I just reach for Bootstrap.
Let's do some programmer art.
But it's kind of like, it's a functional component now, so that's just a refactor. And refactoring is changing the way a component works without actually affecting the behavior. So all of my tests should just stay green.
Yeah.
So this is basically going to add some more markup, but for the most part just classes. It turns it into a nice card component with a header and a card body. But because my tests work against the actual visible bits, the labels and the text, etc., that shouldn't affect my test in any way. So,
And this is why we wrote these tests in the first place, to make sure that we can refactor without breaking anything. And then we have to test to back us up. So.
And this is kind of where Enzyme falls short for me, because then I have to start adding classes
Exactly,
front. And
makes sense.
you could do that, and I could say, well, what's this the state? So I could add a class here on this input saying, this is the state input. But then you would add empty classes just as selector items. And It
Isn't
works.
it possible to select by ID, for instance? Because that's what you see a lot.
You could select them by ID as
Yeah.
well, but again, you would be adding items
Yeah.
just
Just for test purposes.
testing.
Yeah.
And that's not wrong per se. I do that often enough.
Yeah. But it's cool
But
if your testing library is
This is much
can guard
better.
you against that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
nice.
now, well, it's still not very pretty, but it's slightly prettier.
Yeah.
Could have done more to make it pretty, like make sure that all the inputs are lined up nicely. But at least it's a bootstrap card, and we could do another refactor on that to make it prettier. But
And the
I
tests
guess
are still green, right?
the tests, yeah, they should be still green. Let's actually check to be certain.
Awesome.
Yeah,
There
they're
are.
still green. Let's just run them again to make sure.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I
nice.
really like this
So-
framework.
Works really well. This workflow works well for me in cases
Yeah.
where I just do regular components where I kind of know up front what I have to do, but that's most of the time. So
Cool.
And it's at a nice level of abstraction, so you don't need to go into the DOM too much. Yeah, looks good. Hope you enjoyed it too. And I hope you enjoy this mini-series with Maurice on React. If you haven't, check out the previous 2 episodes which cover hooks and what do you call it?
suspense and asynchronous rendering.
And asynchronous rendering. So have fun with those and see you next time. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.